Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, Hotep, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for the last day of Black August, Saturday, August 31st, 2024. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka bringing us some African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, we go on to our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne. He's being joined on the line by Melanie Newport, Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and author of the book, This Is My Jail, Local Politics and the Rise of Mass Incarceration. Then, in the second half of the show, we'll be hearing from Mia Bay, Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of U.S. History at the University of Pennsylvania in Philly, and for our purposes today, author of the book Traveling Black, a story of race and resistance. She'll be on the line with Dr. Horne to talk a little about the content and context of her book. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to please support our efforts here at KPFK. We are volunteer programmers working with the rest of the KPFK family to bring you perspectives and information rarely seen in your mainstream media channels and news feeds. But don't take it from me. Dr. Horne, tell the people a bit about what they can bring home as a thank you for their support.
Pledge a mere $100 and receive as a thank you gift the latest book from Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Read about the distinctions drawn between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Read the first detailed analysis of the shootout at the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers dead. Read the first detailed analysis of the LAPD attack on Panther headquarters in December 1969. Read the first detailed analysis of the August 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse, featuring Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson in an alleged attempt to free his elder brother, George Jackson, and read of the role of the recently deceased political prisoner, Ruchell Magee. Read the first detailed analysis of the attempt at UCLA to fire Professor Angela Davis because of her membership in the U.S. Communist Party and her subsequent trial when she was charged with murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping during the aforementioned county courthouse shootout. Read the first detailed analysis of the Panthers' embassy abroad in Algeria, led by Eldridge Cleaver of Pasadena and Watts, in their attempt to build global solidarity for the Black liberation struggle. Read of the Panthers' solidarity delegations to the nation then known as the People's Republic of the Congo in Brazzaville, and of the Panthers' exile in socialist Cuba. Read of the connections between Hollywood communists and progressives, such as screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, actor Jane Fonda, actor Gene Seberg, screenwriter Donald Freed, basketball star Bill Walton, and producer Bert Schneider, and their support for the Panthers. Read of the severe repression visited upon radical and left-wing forces, which set the stage for the rise of paramilitary forces, often depicted as gangs, and the concomitant rise of the drug epidemic, especially crack cocaine. Read the first detailed analysis of the NAACP chapter in LA, especially the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, which was a cash cow for the national organization, not least because of the contributions from celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. Read of the roots of Kwanzaa, the nationally celebrated Black American holiday. Above all, understand why historically Southern California has been in the vanguard of radicalism and revolutionary upsurges, and how that spirit has yet to be squashed. Again, pledge a mere $100 and receive a signed copy of the latest book by Gerald Horne, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
So pick up the phone and dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Make your pledge and support our efforts here at Freedom Now. Of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Masego, John Coltrane, Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter, Miles Davis, and Thelonious Monk. Now, people, get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Melanie Newport.
Not saying that the men in ours are innocent. I'm saying they are not here because of the crimes that they committed, but because of the color of their skin. Their
Habarigani. This is Sister Luyanda with the African Drum Beat Historical Calendar with
Salah, Yo-Yo, and Ati.
The purpose of this presentation is to put into context our present struggle against the war in Iraq, the war against racism, police brutality, sexism, economic exploitation, within a broad chronological perspective, as to gain strength by standing on the shoulders of our revolutionary ancestors. September 1st, 1961. The armed struggle for the liberation of Eritrea from the Ethiopian Empire begins. Ethiopia, an ancient empire, is composed of many kingdoms brought into the empire under the ancient leaders of Ethiopia. Eritrea revolted against the force of integration into Ethiopia. September 1st, 1892. Queen Kozia, an African woman Shiro, leads one of the many labor revolts in the present-day U.S. colony of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. September 2nd, 1945. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam becomes independent after a long war against Japanese and French imperialism. September 2nd, 1917. Queen Lili Ukulani was the last of the royal Hawaiian monarch of a free Hawaii before U.S. colonization. She resisted the U.S. takeover, and on January 16, 1893, she was arrested and imprisoned by the U.S. Marines during the U.S. invasion to seize Hawaii. September 4, 1841, Preemption Act makes Western United States Native American land open to racist European settler colonialism without any regards or concern for their traditional 500,000-year presence, thus declaring Native Americans non-humans. September 4th, 1973. Salvador Allende, democratically elected Prime Minister of Chile, was overthrown by the CIA-backed military coup and was murdered by the U.S. henchman General Pinochet. American copper corporations dictated to the United States government that Prime Minister Allende must be murdered because he demanded better working conditions for the copper workers of Chile. September 4th, 1895. Qing Yu Huang was born. Qing, a Chinese socialist and women's rights advocate who emerged from the May 4th movement of 1915 to become the teacher and leader of the anti-foot binding campaign, where baby girls' feet were broken and wrapped to produce small feet, a symbol of beauty under feudal China. She was a leading member of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, which defeated the Japanese, United States, and British combined efforts to colonize China. September 4th, 1781. In California, El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora Reina de Los Angeles, later shortened to Los Angeles, was founded. September 4th, 1957. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus calls out the National Guard to bar African students from attending Little Rock High School, which was tax-supported by African residents of Arkansas. This has been the historical calendar on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara, and streaming worldwide at www.kpfk.org. We would like to close out with a collective chant of solidarity with all of those in the listening audience who side with the oppressed, with the masses of humanity, with the environment, with the political spiritual message of Jesus, Allah, Jah, Buddha, or whatever we choose to call, and in the struggle of people over profits. We chant Amandla, and our response is Awetu, which means the power is ours. Amandla, Awetu, Amandla, Awetu, Amandla, Awetu.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Melanie Newport, Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and author of the book, This Is My Jail: Local Politics and the Rise of Mass Incarceration. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Melanie Newport.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
Well, I started out thinking I was going to write a history of kind of all jails in recent U.S. history. But as I cast a wide net, I came across the story of a man named Winston Moore, who was purported to be the first Black jail warden in the United States when he was hired in Chicago at Cook County Jail in 1967 or 68. And so he is really a bombastic figure, kind of larger than life. He's someone who really thought that as a Black man and as a psychologist, he was going to be the salvation of jailed Black people in Chicago, who made up about 90% of the jail's population at that time. What happened, as it often does, with Black faces in high places, he was blamed for many of the jail's problems. And so even as he was able to carry out a lot of expansion, he was ultimately fired for failing to bring order to the jail. So with this figure, I had to know, how did someone like this come to power in the same era when Richard Daley was mayor of Chicago? Why are we not talking about jails as a place where mass incarceration happened?
Mm-hmm. So to what extent is Cook County, Chicago, Illinois, similar to other cities, for example, Los Angeles?
Well, it was very important to me to focus on a jail that had an elected sheriff. Most jails answer to an elected sheriff. And so, there are places like New York City that are, while they are profound political institutions in their own right, I really wanted to bring a history of the sheriff into American urban politics, because we haven't seen that much.
So I take it that there has been resistance to this phenomenon of mass incarceration. Is that a fair perception?
Yes, I mean, that's really the premise of the book is, the extent to which mass incarceration was mitigated and curbed at the local level by activist community members, by prisoner activism, by all kinds of people who said, this is too severe, this is including too many people, this is not in line with our values. It's shocking to say, but mass incarceration could have been so much worse. And so looking at the history of a specific jail, like Cook County Jail, you can see paths not taken in terms of buildings that were not constructed. You can see paths not taken in terms of how bail policies were created to limit the number of people in jail. And that's happening at the same time that statistically we look to this explosion in prison and jails populations as part of the mass incarceration story. It's not inevitable. There's lots of people working to mitigate and curb this harm in their communities.
So to what extent does gender play a role in this phenomenon of mass incarceration?
I think it can go two different ways. One, the jail is used to enforce forms of masculinity, right? That you are a real man if you are a man who works. If you are a man who stays in one place to raise a heterosexual family. And the jail was often used as a place for kind of disciplining masculinity. And so we see in the story, for example, in the 1950s, incarcerated men in the jail really adopted that approach in advocating for their own civil rights, saying that we are forgotten men, that they had an entitlement to citizenship and the protections that come with that. In other examples, women, found themselves as really the focus of many efforts to rehabilitate jailed people, even though they were, in many cases of their incarceration, not found guilty of any crime. They were awaiting trial. And so, as they struggled against this idea that they needed to be rehabilitated, they also advocated for basic things like access to their children, who were not allowed to visit the jail until the 1970s. They were advocating for access to things, basic healthcare resources like gynecological care, because you don't stop having a body once you go to jail. And so even as the jail was a place where gender norms are very much being enforced, and the jail is an institution where urban governments can do that, it's also a place where jailed people understand those dynamics pretty clearly and use those paradigms to resist their incarceration.
Now, to what extent has there been growth in the number of women in jails and prisons in recent years?
I don't have the data specifically on that. It's still a relatively small number, right? I think if you look to the numbers in the 1950s, you would have found that perhaps under 3% of incarcerated people were women. I know now in some places those numbers are closer to 5 or 10 or 20%. One of the things that I take into account with jails is how local politics drive differences in the makeup of the population, which this happens along gender, happens along race as well. But one of the things that had to be constructed were jails that could accommodate women, so care for pregnant women, ways of addressing sexual violence against women from male guard staff, right? You have to hire, in many cases, women corrections officers or jail matrons to manage this female population. And so, growth happens. We can think about growth happening in terms of prison beds or jail beds being added to an institution. But one of the things I emphasize in the book is that the quality of incarceration changes, and that we're expanding the role that the jail plays in people's family lives, the role that it plays in their lives as men or women, in their relationships, in their job prospects. And so I think, we can see that kind of quality story happening with the incarceration of women.
So, to what extent has there been a growth in the number of Black prisoners in recent years?
So I would say in recent years, not quite as much. In the story of Cook County, and this is going to vary for every jail and jail system, by the 1950s, about half of the people in jail in Chicago were African American. Right. So one of the claims that I make in the book is that there has always been mass incarceration in Chicago. If we define mass incarceration as the disparate incarceration of people of color. By the 1970s, 1980s, that number was closer to 90% African American in the jail. From the 1980s forward, the proportion of Black people in Cook County Jail has gone down as the number of Latinx people has gone up. So these proportions are always changing. It has a lot to do with where policing is happening, to what extent drugs are being criminalized, to what extent are people getting their welfare needs met by the state, and to what extent are prosecutors using their discretion either to ensure that people don't stay in jail before trial or that they do. So all of those things are going to impact the proportion of people in jail racially, but also the kind of ideologies that people bring to jailing. So one of the things that I found in Chicago that was so troubling to me was the way that racial ideologies shape the jail. So the idea that if Black people are not good citizens, that they need to go to jail to learn how. If they are not good workers, they need to go to the jail to learn how. And so one of the things that we still see today at the jail is people will say, oh, I visited Cook County Jail. I had the pizza, because the sheriff has a very small program where incarcerated men learn how to make pizza. And I've heard the pizza is very good. But again, do Black men need to go to jail to learn how to make pizza, right? Is that an obligation that we see is valid for the state? Can people learn how to make pizza outside the jail and still be fed and still benefit from that? And so, part of taking into account the idea of racial ideologies in jail governance is challenging the ways that people use race to make the case for the jail being good.
You also mentioned that decades of records with regard to this jail have disappeared, gone up in smoke. How so? Why? And what impact has that had on our understanding of jailing?
Right. Well, like a lot of people who are interested in local politics, I used processes created by the Freedom of Information Act to request records. And at different points in my research, I was told either those records do not exist, or I was told that they might exist, but I was not going to be allowed to access them. And because I didn't have any institutional records in the way that you might go to a university archive and look at the records of a university that they kept, that kind of thing doesn't exist for jails. And so, it wasn't necessarily surprising. It was frustrating. But it challenged me to look with greater care, not just to kind of track the what happened story that you can maybe tell with things like newspapers, but also to read between the lines to find the story of jailed people as they brought lawsuits, as they struggled to make connections with their family, as they experienced heartache and pain during their incarceration. And so if there is an upside to writing a book about a jail, which is a very depressing experience, it was that I found so many sources where incarcerated people were telling the story of their incarceration and trying to change their circumstances.
Now, there was a notorious fire in Chicago in 1871. What impact did that have on incarceration?
Well, they already had moved one of the city's jails, the Chicago House of Correction, into the west side of the city. When the Cook County Jail went up in flames in 1871 during the Great Fire, incarcerated people were enlisted to help rebuild the city. There's kind of some questions about where the jail was located during this time. I think most jailed people were moved to the city jail, which is at the current jail site now, at 26th and California. But as with anything, right, this is a moment when kind of the prairie upstart of Chicago, this kind of scorched earth gives way to the metropolis of Chicago. And so as Chicago becomes a site of increased migration, particularly for Black Americans into the 20th century, this is really going to shape their perceptions of what do we need a jail for? And the answer they come up with is to deal with all these outsiders who don't know how to play by our rules. And so part of kind of making the identity of the city is using the jail to incarcerate people, who, for example, were anarchists advocating for the 8-hour day during the Haymarket Affair. Anyone who dared rock the boat in Chicago found themselves inside Cook County Jail at some point.
Finally, Melanie Newport, author of the book, This Is My Jail, Local Politics and the Rise of Mass Incarceration. What's next on your research agenda?
So with John Bardez, I'm co-editing the Cambridge Companion to American Carceral History. As of right now, we have 17 authors who are going to tell the story of policing, incarceration, criminalization in colonial America and the United States, basically from the 1600s all the way to the present. And so really working to kind of unsettle the idea that mass incarceration started in the 1970s, but that this is something that is very much part of the fabric of our national story.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Melanie Newport, author of the book, This Is My Jail. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
Special thanks to Professor Newport for sharing her work with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? That's why we encourage you to support the station today. Your donation helps KPFK keep programs like this on the air so you can get a little bit more information about what's lesser told on the news. You can even take home a special little something as a thank you. So, Dr. Horne, tell the people a little bit about what they can take home today.
Pledge a mere $100 and receive as a thank you gift the latest book from Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Read about the distinctions drawn between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Read the first detailed analysis of the shootout at the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers dead. Read the first detailed analysis of the LAPD attack on Panther headquarters in December 1969. Read the first detailed analysis of the August 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse, featuring Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson in an alleged attempt to free his elder brother, George Jackson, and read of the role of the recently deceased political prisoner, Ruchell Magee. Read the first detailed analysis of the attempt at UCLA to fire Professor Angela Davis because of her membership in the U.S. Communist Party and her subsequent trial when she was charged with murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping during the aforementioned county courthouse shootout. Read the first detailed analysis of the Panthers' embassy abroad in Algeria, led by Eldridge Cleaver of Pasadena and Watts, and their attempt to build global solidarity for the Black liberation struggle. Read of the Panthers' solidarity delegations to the nation then known as the People's Republic of the Congo in Brazzaville, and of the Panthers' exile in socialist Cuba. Read of the connections between Hollywood communists and progressives, such as screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, actor Jane Fonda, actor Gene Seberg, screenwriter Donald Freed, basketball star Bill Walton and producer Bert Schneider and their support for the Panthers. Read of the severe repression visited upon radical and left-wing forces, which set the stage for the rise of paramilitary forces, often depicted as gangs, and the concomitant rise of the drug epidemic, especially crack cocaine. Read the first detailed analysis of the NAACP chapter in LA, especially the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, which was a cash cow for the national organization, not least because of the contributions from celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. Read of the roots of Kwanzaa, the nationally celebrated Black American holiday. Above all, understand why historically Southern California has been in the vanguard of radicalism and revolutionary upsurges, and how that spirit has yet to be squashed. Again, pledge a mere $100 and receive a signed copy of the latest book by Gerald Horne, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
So pick up the phone and dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now, getting right back to it, we're going to send you right on back to Dr. Horne, who's being joined by Professor Mia Bay. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For Pacifica Radio KPFK, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Mia Bay, Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols, Professor of U.S. History at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and author of the book Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Mia Bay.
Thank you, Gerald Horne. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you write this book, Traveling Black?
A couple of different reasons. I had written a biography of Ida B. Wells, who really became an activist after she was thrown off a train in Mississippi in the early 1880s. She was thrown out of what was called a ladies' car because even though there wasn't formal Jim Crow at that point, people were beginning to question whether blacks could ride in first-class accommodations. And I was fascinated by the gender component. I began to think about how segregation had to be invented, and I wondered how it had been invented on other forms of transportation that came later, such as buses.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a gender component. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, yes, that was what fascinated me, because one thing I learned from studying Ida B. Wells was that prior to the advent of colored cars and whites-only cars, there had been ladies' cars and smoking cars. That was an older system of segregation of a kind. And it was all about, on the part of the railroads, getting, middle-class white women to ride the trains, which were a new form of technology that were considered dangerous, and they could be a little dirty and smoky because of all the men who rode them. So they started to offer special accommodations for women. And these were the kind of accommodations where the presence of Black people started to become an issue. And as I studied this across the various forms of transportation, including things like stagecoaches and steamships, it really became that part of what travel providers were trying to offer people was, a form of travel where you felt like you were comfortable in your own living room with your own people. And for that was one of the impulses behind segregation. There were many others, but this sort of catering to white women and seeking to make travel comfortable and something that you were participating in a kind of almost domestic setting were among the things that drove prejudices against Black travelers.
Now, did the auto age, introduced in the United States about 120 odd years ago, introduce a new dynamic? For example, resentment of Black people in new cars or in cars at all, resentment at them passing in the left-hand lane, etc.
Absolutely. Black people hope that the auto age would sort of free them from the kind of constraints of Jim Crow and prejudices, because after all, cars are kind of private. But there was this idea from the very beginning that automobiles were this kind of, elite technology that Black people shouldn't partake in. There were questions when cars were first put in use about whether Black people would be even capable of driving cars. It was a period of time where people imagined that automobile drivers would use white chauffeurs because Blacks would not be able to manage anything more complicated than a horse and buggy. This, of course, proved untrue, but this connection between nice automobiles and a kind of signification of whiteness and class privilege would continue, to the point that for many years, Blacks in the South often chose Ford automobiles or other less sort of luxury line automobiles over fancier cars for fear of alienating whites who did resent Blacks who drove nice cars. So that was, absolutely remained the case. And also car advertisers really on the luxury end really did not seek black buyers for decades.
Was there an attempt by U.S. white supremacists to export U.S. Jim Crow abroad? For example, to bar Black people from hotels in France or elsewhere in Europe, Asia, even Africa?
Yes, that was absolutely the case. It was common enough that in Europe, which was the place where white Americans most frequently traveled, this kind of effect was called the Southernization of Europe. There was an expectation among white travelers that just as they had, did not expect to see Blacks in hotels in the United States, they wouldn't see them in Europe. There was pressure put on European travel providers to make these, sort of observe these forms of discrimination, which they were somewhat unlikely to do. So there were tensions around it, but there were also, some clashes between American travelers, Black and white, over these issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about distinctions and differences between and amongst traveling on ocean vessels versus airlines versus railroads? Or were they all more or less the same in terms of enforcing Jim Crow?
No, I kind of, as I was sort of observing and also paying attention to what people were saying, I kind of came up with a hierarchy of sort of, this is horrifying, that buses were the worst, of course. And, you had people like Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison, people kind of indicating that buses were terrible because when you got on a bus, you had to walk through a kind of gauntlet of white people to get to the back. And also on buses, there was no fixed line of demarcation. So if lots of white people wanted to get on the bus, there might be no Black section on the bus. And also there was no kind of separation. The Jim Crow car was not something that African Americans appreciated, but it did provide a kind of space for Black people, which the buses did not necessarily have. In fact, during the war years of World War II, Black people frequently had to wait for days to get a bus because they would sort of stand there in those southern stations waiting for a bus that had seats after all the white people got on first, which was the ritual in the South. So buses were the worst. Trains definitely came second. The Jim Crow car, as I write about in my book, was a very inferior accommodation in many different ways. It was usually also the smoking car, sometimes the luggage car, the car where the conductor and other train employees sat, the car where if there were any barnyard animals traveling with people, they sometimes ended up there too. So people did not like the Jim Crow car, and they resented the sort of way it very much sort of drove home to anyone who looked inside it that this was a second class accommodation for inferior people. Cars and airplanes were definitely better. There were not a lot of African Americans traveling on airplanes until the 50s and 60s at the earliest. There was some early separate seating, which was never systematic or legalized or even something everyone experienced. So there was some agreement that airplane travel was better, but African Americans also encountered discrimination at the airport in the form of restaurants that did not admit Black people, segregated restrooms, and often, and perhaps the most inconvenient thing, segregated cabs. You could, spend a lot of money on an airplane ticket and arrive at your destination and wait for the black cab, the cab line that picks up Black people for hours. So that's all sort of made the great convenience of airplane travel less than what it was. And then finally, cars were complicated. They offered people a certain amount of autonomy and privacy on the road, but all of the sort of support systems that are required to make cars genuinely useful for long distance travel, like gas stations, motels, hotels, roadside restaurants, those fairly early on started to exercise various forms of discrimination, which is why you ended up with people having to figure out all these strategies about how to drive cross country, figure out where they could stay, where they could not stay, where they could buy gas, where they couldn't buy gas. And this is, of course, why you get things like the Green Book, which has sort of recently become something people remember again. And it also is something that was never entirely addressed by things like the Green Book. The Green Book was frequently not up to date and didn't cover all places people had to go. So people really had to travel very differently than most Americans. They had to make kind of elaborate plans about where they would stay, and people did things like drive at night to avoid harassment from people who found them unwelcome at various places. They did things like carry their own food and sometimes even gas to avoid stopping. These were all sort of rituals for Black drivers for many years. So all these forms of transportation pose somewhat different kinds of challenges, but they all did pose challenges.
What about ocean-going vessels? Were there any peculiarities with regard to that form of transportation?
I ended up stopping this particular book at the border of the U.S. because one of the things I noticed was that a lot of what African Americans had to say about traveling beyond the boundaries of America was often kind of focused on the argument they wanted to make about the U.S. But I did do enough research for it to be clear that there were ocean-going vessels that were very much Southernized, where Black people were not allowed to eat with other folks. You see that in things like Frederick Douglass's experiences in traveling abroad. The British line, the Cunard line, frequently subjected people to various forms of discrimination. And then there were some vessels, other lines that did not do so. It was sort of sometimes a mixture of policies and what the people aboard were pushing for.
I take it that there were systematic campaigns against this form of Jim Crow.
There were systematic complaints for sure. I don't know if there were systematic campaigns I haven't seen any evidence of campaigns when it came to ocean liners. I've seen a lot of complaints against ocean liners and also vessels that travel to the Caribbean, exercising discrimination against Black passengers.
Mhm. What about the role of violence in imposing these norms?
Within the boundaries of the U.S., violence was tremendously important, especially in the South, and it skyrocketed during the years of World War I and World War II. Black people, especially Black men, who defied any of the myriad customs and laws around segregation, which differed from place to place, from state to state, from town to town, could find themselves subject to violence. Black travelers could also do things like accidentally end up in a sundown town after the sun was going down. And, that's where you got Black men being beat up, even killed. One of the reasons why you see more suits, I would say, and more formal complaints from women is that the Black men who are in the wrong place at the wrong time more frequently subject to violence.
So what's next on the research agenda, Bay?
Well, I am actually a little bit interested in following up this question of what happens on ocean liners. So I'm thinking of digging into that, and thinking more broadly about boats. There's limited numbers of places in the U.S. where boats are a primary form of transportation, but there were a lot of incidents on ferries in Maryland and on the Mississippi River. So I've been thinking about doing a little more research on that. But I also am currently going back to a project I've been working on for a while, which is a book about African American ideas about Thomas Jefferson.
Well, that'll be a multi-volume study, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's a challenging topic.
So finally, Mia Bay, Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols, professor of U.S. History at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, author of the book Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance. To our younger audience, would you recommend that they investigate the University of Pennsylvania as a site for undergraduate or graduate study?
I would absolutely encourage them. Philadelphia is a great, very diverse, very interesting city to live in. So I think students have a wonderful time here. The university has a lot of resources and a strong commitment to undergraduate education. So I would encourage students to look at the University of Pennsylvania.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Mia Bay. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Pledge a mere $100 and receive as a thank you gift the latest book from Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Read about the distinctions drawn between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Read the first detailed analysis of the shootout at the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers dead. Read the first detailed analysis of the LAPD attack on Panther headquarters in December 1969. Read the first detailed analysis of the August 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse, featuring Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson in an alleged attempt to free his elder brother, George Jackson, and read of the role of the recently deceased political prisoner, Ruchell McGee. Read the first detailed analysis of the attempt at UCLA to fire Professor Angela Davis because of her membership in the U.S. Communist Party and her subsequent trial when she was charged with murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping during the aforementioned county courthouse shootout. Read the first detailed analysis of the Panthers' embassy abroad in Algeria, led by Eldridge Cleaver of Pasadena and Watts, and their attempt to build global solidarity for the Black liberation struggle. Read of the connections between Hollywood communists and progressives, such as screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, actor Jane Fonda, actor Gene Seberg, screenwriter Donald Freed, basketball star Bill Walton, and producer Bert Schneider, and their support for the Panthers. Read of the severe repression visited upon radical and left-wing forces, which set the stage for the rise of paramilitary forces, often depicted as gangs, and the concomitant rise of the drug epidemic, especially crack cocaine. Read the first detailed analysis of the NAACP chapter in LA, especially the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, which was a cash cow for the national organization, not least because of the contributions from celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. Read of the roots of Kwanzaa, the nationally celebrated Black American holiday. Above all, understand why historically Southern California has been in the vanguard of radicalism and revolutionary upsurges, and how that spirit has yet to be squashed. Again, pledge a mere $100 and receive a signed copy of the latest book by Gerald Horne, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Melanie Newport from the University of Connecticut. Find a Black-owned bookstore near you today and get her book, This Is My Jail: Local Politics and the Rise of Mass Incarceration. Then, we'd like to thank Professor Mia Bay from the University of Pennsylvania and encourage our listeners to find her book, Traveling Black: A Story of Race and Resistance. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to Sister Luyanda Kaboka on the historical calendar. And of course, special thanks to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thank you to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. Please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers, and the station needs your help to pay the bills and keep the lights on in the building. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org, scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.